Welcome back to The Value of Everything. We are going to be looking into the historic lead up to the migrant crisis, be it a little bit more UK centric, but the same rules apply to most people in the West. So when we talk about tyranny, we're looking at secret societies and the tools that they use. In most Western cultures, and pretty much every single culture other than the ones who are maybe indigenous to the cradle of mankind, which would be some area in Ethiopia. If you go back through a person's lineage, you'll eventually find that there is an immigrant at a certain point in time. When you look at me, I'm an immigrant from the UK to Australia, and when you go through the family tree, you're going to find a load of Irish immigrants, Jewish immigrants, and obviously some English there as well. However, when you look at the English as a race is a mixture of Germanic tribes, Norse or Viking tribes. So you have a lot of people from Norway, especially up north, the Roman Empire, and they conscripted a lot of people throughout Europe. You have the Jutes, which is a Danish tribe, and they settled predominantly in the southeast of the UK. If you actually listen to a Danish person speak in English, their accent can be pretty indistinguishable to a middle-class person from Kent. And if you go back further to the Romans, you're going to find a number of Celtic tribes, all split up. It looks kind of like what you would find in, say, Africa before colonialism had its conquests. So really, I am a mongrel, but that is really applied to most people of the West. Now, if you go back, I did actually mention an immigration of a culture rather than a race. I think it's important to delineate the two of these because in this very racially charged environment that we live in today, people are branded and shut down as racists before there can be any dialogue. Now, I think here I'd like to just identify what is the problem with mass migration, and I can use it with an example of myself. So I have emigrated to Australia, and I will never be Australian. Now, maybe on paper and all that kind of stuff, but let's just say somebody who's have got a family tree in Australia, lived there all their lives, they will always deem me as someone from the UK. It's not going to change. I've got an accent. I've got particular ways and mannerisms which are going to be slightly different to Australia. Now, considering that Australia is a colony of the UK, there isn't too much of a divergence in our shared values, maybe for freedom, for democracy, to respect each other's property, things like that. Now, these are just the very overarching umbrellas of our cultural relations, but then there is some very acute cultural differences where it comes to, say, comedy, say, sport, say, what we like to do on the weekends. There is these tiny differences. Now, as I blend into this culture, there is probably some things which I give back to this culture, which is rejuvenating it, as well as there's stuff that I'm adapting into my culture. So let's just say that there is a very agreeable blending between our cultures. Now, for example, say in an office environment, we're very good at ribbing each other. So just having a little dig or a tickle, you could sort of almost class it as bullying, but it's not really, as long as you can talk back in the office. Now, I've understood sometimes where we've had Americans, they don't quite understand that tiny piece of ribbing that we do. But then there is something that the UK culture does more than Australian culture, which is self-deprecation. So when I see somebody's personality, I see that they have taken adaptations predominantly from their parents, but also from their close friends and relatives, and that embodies their personality. And so, therefore, there is a mixture So personalities can quite easily interlink with each other, but also we know that personalities can clash. If you have a personality clash, and there isn't necessarily that there's one dominant personality, and so therefore that personality clash will eventually have to adapt. There is a resource of both of those personalities, therefore there is never an opportunity for an adaptation to occur. Then that's where you get cultural isolation from each other, and then that breeds itself further and further until they are so isolated and opposed from each other that any slight incident which occurs is like lighting a match on a barrel of TNT. Even just you listening to me right now, and say if you agree with what I'm saying, there is obviously some kind of personality blending which is occurring here, where we're both agreeable, amicable, and maybe you might think of what I said and adapt it into your language and refer it to somebody else. So that's that part. Now, I've got children here in Australia, and if they grow up and lead a life in Australia, let's just say, for example, they're going to be pretty much classed as Australians. They probably still will in their lives feel like there's a tiny bit of distance between them not quite fully fitting in and maybe just having some kind of longing for UK or comedy and things like that. So even with them, they might still feel that way. But then, say from their kids' generation onwards, they will pretty much be full Australians. There'll be nothing really quite to distinguish them from anybody else. So UK is very multicultural, and there is some great examples of second generation, third generation people who are about as British as you can get. And it obviously that is a brilliant thing. It's a beautiful thing. They will class themselves as British, and I would say that they probably would even still class themselves as British over their own race. So there is some fantastic examples of that. But there we also have a problem, and the problem lies within a culture which doesn't choose to integrate or adapt to the society and have that blending which occurs. And the problem becomes even more amplified when immigration turns into mass immigration, and it increases on an exponential level, so that the native cultural personality is being isolated and pushed into a corner where they feel like there is some kind of cultural bleaching of the people that are already there. Now, I'm going to talk to you about a politician who was quite prevalent in the 1960s and 70s. His name was Enoch Powell. So I knew of Enoch Powell. He had a reputation of being a racist, and really when I've listened to Parliament speak, they always refer to the Rivers of Blood speech and pretty much state that that's a dark time in British history. Now, when reviewing video clips from the man, I noticed that he is a very personable guy. He's not like your typical aristocratic man who's talking in airs and graces. It's a very down-to-earth person, particularly from the 70s. And the other interesting thing is that I found a snippet from Margaret Thatcher, who speaks of Enoch Powell in some very positive terms. So what was this Rivers of Blood speech all about? Well, to begin with, this speech actually got him expelled, and this was done by Ted Heath, who does appear to be having a lot of bad press since his death. Now, Ted Heath is the man who brought Britain into the EU, so that again does raise some significant questions. Now, this speech was never fully recorded. Only parts of the speech was recorded. Therefore, the basis of Enoch Powell's words were not fully understood. But let me just outline how he was putting it to the people. So, in the speech, he refers to a conversation with his constituent. In this conversation, the constituent says that he's got 3 children that went to grammar school, and they've got children now, but he wants them all to leave the country. And this constituent states that in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man. So this is fairly racial from the get-go. However, to clarify, this is not necessarily Enoch's thoughts. Enoch knows how inflammatory this is and states that he can already hear the crowd's reaction. How dare I say such a horrible thing? And thereafter he states the answer is that I do not have the right not to do so. He goes on a little bit further about what the constituent says in terms that the country is not worth living in for his children. He is saying what thousands and hundreds of thousands of British people are thinking. Not throughout, but in an area which is undergoing a transfer to which there has been no parallel in 1,000 years of history. Enoch then forecasts future trends of immigration population, which apparently he underestimated, and then he goes on to state that actions should be taken so evils should be prevented or minimized. The significance and consequence of an alien element introduced is profoundly different according to whether the element is 1% or 10%. The answers to the simple and rational question are equally simple and rational. By stopping or virtually stopping further inflow and promoting maximum outflow. So there is an encouragement of re-immigration. Now, as he continues, he states that all citizens should be equal under law, and there shouldn't be legislation which discriminates against a certain minority or majority. The reasons for this is that resentment will increase. He goes on to say, for reasons which they could not comprehend, and in a pursuance of a decision by default on which they are never consulted, they found themselves made strangers in their own country. They found their wives unable to obtain hospital beds in childbirth, their children unable to obtain school places, their homes and neighbourhoods changed beyond recognition, their plans and prospects for the future defeated. At work, they found that their employers hesitate to apply to the immigrant worker the standards of discipline and competence required of the native-born worker. So, he's outlining now they're unwanted and it's dangerous to share the same views of Enoch. He also recounts a story of a native widowed woman living in a changing community who's been persecuted because she refused immigrants into her boarding house. He goes on to say, hitherto it has been a force of circumstance and of background which has rendered the very idea of integration inaccessible to the greater part of the immigrant population. That they never conceived or intended such a thing, and that their numbers and physical concentration meant the pressures towards integration which normally bear upon a small minority did not operate, with a view of actual domination. Here Enoch's isolating a certain religious culture, and that's the Sikh community. Now, I would say the Sikh community is fairly compatible with British culture. With my very minimal knowledge, I noticed that there's a lot of Sikhs which are drinkers. I've met some very funny guys before who are Sikhs. I guess they keep themselves a bit to themselves, but I wouldn't imagine that they're going to be totally isolated from British communities. Also, their religion has a little bit more of a part to play in ascension, and all people and even animals are equal. So that's fairly a compatible standard. But Enoch here does put the target sights on this community and states, the Sikh community's campaign to maintain customs inappropriate in Britain is much to be regretted. Working in Britain, particularly in public services, they should be prepared to accept the terms and conditions of their employment. To claim special communal rights, or should one say rights, R-I-T-E-S, leads to a dangerous fragmentation within society. This communalism is a canker. Whether practiced by one colour or another, it is to be strongly condemned. For these dangerous and divisive elements, the legislation proposed in the Race Relations Bill is the very pallium they need to flourish. Here is the means of showing that the immigrant communities can organise to consolidate their members, to agitate and campaign against their fellow citizens, and to overawe and dominate the rest with legal weapons which the ignorant and the ill-informed have provided. So here is where Enoch Powell quotes Virgil, a Roman poet, with these words: "As I look ahead, I'm filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood." And his final call to action at the end is he states that only resolute and urgent action will avert the event now. Whether there will be the public will to demand and obtain that action, I do not know. All I know is that to see and not speak would be a great betrayal. So that's quite a rhetoric-based speech, but he has actually put in there a peppermint of ethos, pathos, and logos. He's using a lot of pathos, but he is actually using everything within the triangle to make his argument. So, without any shadow of a doubt, everything is centered around an emotional plea. However, he is actually punching that through with logic and reason, proof, and he's trying to use background stories of credibility and trust as well. He is a politician, and he is one of the most popular politicians of his time. Now, also, what's to be highlighted within isolating the Sikh community is that maybe even if the Sikh community comes to Britain and they request certain rights, maybe it opens the door for other things to continue. So maybe the Sikh community open the door for the Muslims to expand on their rights. So integration issues of the Sikh community doesn't necessarily measure up to the Muslim community. However, there's some good points which could be outlined that the opening of certain legislation could have opened the door for non-integration of, say, the Muslim communities. Now, just a little anecdotal story from my side. I got picked up by a cab driver the other day, and I would say he was of the kindest disposition that anybody could find. His nationality originally was Pakistani, but he was just so kind and warm and friendly and wanted to talk about families and offered me a peach. I know it's a bit strange being in a cab and being offered a peach, but all of those are just like very beautiful, kind things, and how he's offered help to his neighbours. And even when I asked him about his religion, he didn't really pray as much as he wanted to. But you could see that there was an absolute amount of honesty, integrity, kindness, all the virtues that most societies would embrace. So obviously you cannot tarnish the entire Muslim community with the same brush. But let me continue, because this is really an important subject when it comes to communities. So going back to Enoch and this speech, it's really interesting, the events that surrounds this, because it looks like Ted Heath, who appears to be a paedophile and is probably most liable to blackmail, was emphasizing the UK to join this single market. Interesting, there was I think maybe like the marketeers and the anti-market people. Now, I don't think that sounds very good branding when you're an anti-market. But with Enoch's speech, it did actually make him even more incredibly powerful. If the UK was working with a presidency, he would have no trouble in becoming a political leader. Ted Heath was not a very personable person by any means, particularly of his shady background, which is coming to light right now. So I think it's quite easy to make this assumption, and maybe there's some other good arguments and things which could be brought forth, is that our political leaders were duped maybe into us going into the EU, and we had political outliers like Enoch Powell who were extremely popular but were shunned. So Ted Heath actually made Enoch Powell resign from his position because of his politically inflammatory speech. Now, after his speech, there was some demonstrations to state that they wanted Enoch Powell in power. However, it wasn't necessarily that violent, but it's really since this moment and Ted Heath making Enoch Powell resign, he really was an outsider of the party. And even though he had an incredible intellect, you could tell that his skill of debate is leagues above what you see in today's standard. Now, the question is, was his speech inflammatory? Now, I would say it was inflammatory. It was using what Donald Trump used, which was hyperbole, to attract attention to himself and yet have some tokens of truth, or at least sticking to the truth, so that he would never be accused of being a fantasist and discarded to one side. Now, also, if people do see that somebody is speaking the truth and they get casted to one side, then that can lead to resentment. And more than likely, rather than the middle parties like your Labour and Conservatives, this created more extreme parties like the BNP, the National Front, which were probably created as a mark of distrust against the main political parties. So, in my opinion, was Enoch wrong to state this? Well, I think there was some inflammatory stuff which was going on here. However, when it comes to mass migration, I think overall he was probably correct. Basically, a culture is really a fragile thing once it's outnumbered, and eventually at a certain point the culture just gets changed. So say for example, if extremist Muslims took over 50% of the UK, then it really wouldn't take too much for that to reach a boiling point and to completely convert the culture of the people. Now, you got to think about what a nationality is in a respect. It is an identity of shared values. Now, obviously, there is race as well involved in this, but let's just keep it out of discriminating against race for one moment. Now, I've always made the case that in isolation and with the deduction of certain things, that a certain stroke of brilliance can occur. Just, for example, look at cuisine. Now, it's not like British culture is the greatest cuisines, but if you look at Japanese culture, they're fantastic at their different elements of food, and they have been isolated with certain foods, like they've got only abundance of fish and rice and things like that to create their cuisines. Now, on the other hand, you've got somewhere like the Mediterranean, totally different recipes because there's different abundance of goods and the environment that creates. So even though monoculture in comparison to a multiculture is going to have its limitations on an individualist level, on a monocultural individualist level, they potentially have an interest to pursue a certain goal, which they all have a share in. Now, most nationalities would have a goal to increase their living standards, and their living standards would be prioritized in a certain way. Now, you also have cultures which will have a kind of a dominance, maybe just by the sheer act of its religion. There's certain different cultures which will lead in different directions and create certain benefits. Now, if you look at particular Muslim cultures of different centuries, there was a great bounty of things like mathematics, which is coming from Muslim cultures. So I would state that in isolation, there is definite divergences which are good. Now, even if I say, like, if you're on your own and you've got your own independent thoughts and you're writing your own fictional story, there's going to be a lot more divergence than in comparison that everyone's in the same classroom and everyone stands up and reads a passage of their story to each other and then sits down and then continues writing, because everyone's eventually going to start copying each other to be the same. So uniqueness and identity and those little quirks can lead to specific things which are quite beautiful. We're living in this time of globalization where everything gets washed and the comedy, the art all becomes particularly bland because it has to appeal to every culture around the world. And it really doesn't necessarily mean that what one person enjoys is what the other person does. That's why, say for example, Star Wars isn't necessarily appealing to everyone nowadays, even though it does score higher Internet Movie Database scores. Really, a lot of people are saying, well, this ain't that great anymore. And that's because of what a socialist corporate class of people will choose and tick boxes to say, oh, yes, this appeals to me. And anything that gets the most votes will make it into the pictures. Now, it doesn't appeal to its uniqueness and to touch very deeply with people. What touches me very deeply is completely different, I would imagine, to somebody who is Muslim. So one of the most obvious things when identifying certain cultures is our accents. Now, accents are a very interesting thing because even an accent can seem more trustworthy, more intelligent. There is different assumptions which are made within an accent itself. And also, an accent, probably more so than anything else, will act as something which you would distrust from being different to what yours is. I remember even things like in the London East End, there would be a rhyming slang which basically meant, say for example, if you wanted to say stairs, you would say apples and pears or just pears, and that would mean stairs. So you created your own kind of language amongst each other. And that's another interesting thing with language itself. A language will isolate one group of people to another. And now you could say that hostilities can arise when people do not mix. So probably the most fundamental thing here is, and if a culture didn't even change its language and moved into another country, you could almost state that that is a type of invasion. Now, obviously, the most important thing here of what happened with mass migration society is that communities are not having any control of who can join their society. And particularly the people that are making the decisions aren't necessarily the ones who are being affected by the decisions. So, say for example, if a big migrant community was moving into the West Midlands, I would very much doubt that all the major politicians would be affected by this. Back to Enoch Powell. Another question might arise is, was he a racist? Now, I think that he mentioned many times that he was never a racist, and he's written many times before of his admiration of Indian culture, which is fairly interesting because of his mentioning of the Sikh community that's moving in. Also, the interesting thing here, and this is a particular thing when it comes to fascism, which is basically the national interests taking over the means of production, is that he had the support of the trade unions, which is very interesting. Everyone sees politics as right and left, but as you creep from one extreme to the other, the support of trade unions or the workers becomes stronger. So with communities, it's interesting to outline their directives. because it gives you a little bit more clarity of what's going on and what's their mentality and how well they all integrate. So with the Jewish community, it has an extreme in-group preference, as you can only be Jewish via your mother. By their religion standards, they'll never be a multiracial community. Maybe slightly, but it's pretty much that they're going to be a fairly white community. Now, Muslims, on the other hand, cannot marry non-believers of Islam, which are infidels, so they'll never be multicultural. The question is, does never being multiracial or never being multicultural give them an advantage in domination over others? So you can see what I've done here. I've highlighted two communities, both persecuted quite a lot, and obviously throughout history the Jews have been always accused of the controlling of money and finance and media, and that has given them too much power so that they can dominate what the globalists want. And then obviously the Muslim societies have got their own bad press in the sense that they will move into a community and they will isolate themselves. This is probably the more extremist end of Islam, and they will not integrate. So let's look at cultures now, because culture doesn't necessarily have to apply to a race or neither a religion, because a culture can be a secret service. Their nature is to protect the nation from danger. However, they operate by keeping information away from the public. Have you ever heard of the intelligence community? Well, they are a culture as well. And when we ask a question, what is culture? It's defined as the ideas, customs, and social behavior of a particular people or society. So we have a secret service or intelligence community which works and operates without us really knowing. Also, something that's hidden is called an occult. So we have an occult which works behind. Now, communities have been accused of creating occults in the background. This can happen with Masonic secret societies. A lot of politicians and people who work in the law get caught up in the occult. Now, you can go so far as to say that a multicultural society cannot speak out through fear of recourse. This is quite akin to how whites feel in a town which has had mass migration and has changed their society. There is some relations here. Have you ever heard of corporate culture? So corporate culture refers to the beliefs and behaviors that determine how a company's employees and management interacts and handles the outside business transactions. Again, in a high unemployment, reputation-based environment, people are in fear to speak out through fear of recourse. So are you seeing a trend here? We are censored by cultures. Now, if one culture is more censored than the other, the lesser censor needs to raise to comply. And as a consequence of this, everything is watered down, as I mentioned before. Education, office banter, the local council directives. But there is one problem here. If one culture is for freedom or non-suppression, a little bit anti-culture in a way, if we look at censorship, and the other culture wishes to enforce, then conflict arises. This can happen within a religious faith as well. Also, a freedom-loving culture again can self-center, making them more inapt to stand up for what they believe in. Only the ones who hold the sword may act. Yet if they are divided across multi-cultures, the responses are muted. A culture which has the sword in hand is always stronger. Now, does the Second Amendment sound more reasonable to you? So we just replace the sword with the gun, I guess. So what happens sometimes with the multicultural is that a certain culture is like a spring which gets suppressed until it cannot be pushed down any further and the spring pops back. So there's a boiling point which spills over. And as we know, all these attacks leads to further escalation. So as you can see, mass migration leads to segregation. This is the main logical point that Enoch gets to, and I would agree with him on this point. It's interesting actually just to look at language and see what the word invasion means. Now, invasion is obviously a referral to a military offensive. However, it can be referred to as either conquering, re-establishing control, or authority over a territory. So it does really make you scratch your head sometimes when cultures which are so incompatible move in with each other because a type of invasion is occurring. But really, life is very complicated. We live in a multiple cultural society, but it's not necessarily drawn on racial, religious lines. It really crosses a lot of divergencies, even from sport, if you're into the mainstream, if you're into the extreme, if you're part of a secret society, or some kind of a cult, or you're not. Really, there is an immense amount of complexity in this, and it does make us inapt to act. So in terms of mass migration, if you just took it down to a singular level, if one single black child from Africa was adopted into a white family in a white community, they would lead to be a very white person. But this is not necessarily a racist thing to say. You could even say, for example, that most people would choose to have a child raised in a black community of hard workers over a white community of layabouts. So there is complexity, but really we do have this thing of, really it goes down to the mass. It goes to a point in which there is no return. Where I advocate things like anarchism and living in micro-societies, the major thing here is that there probably will be some kind of territory which will be marked out, and there'll definitely be some kind of acceptance or voting or ballot of whether certain people will be accepted to either trade and work within that community or even live in that community. So the micro-society would have a choice in the matter of whether they could mix. And pretty much that really hits the nail on the head of a lot of these issues, where there is a disconnect of politicians making choices for people in communities that they really have never been in, really is what leads us to this point. And you could go so far as to say the fascists did have some arguments which were okay. There are the Marxists that have some good arguments as well. But once we take it down, obviously the fascists really it usually ends up to creating a dictator who wants a totalitarian state, all for the deems of the national interest. Certain things happen like eugenics, which wants to create a certain soldier which will not ever question the state and will always just be obedient and lay down their life. It always comes down to like living in some kind of hive, whereas anarcho-anarchism has more of a relevance to the individual making choices, transparencies, and really there's more of a shared value community where there's social integration, which is very important. You can't ever see that a micro-society is really going to just open its doors to a culture which cannot integrate at all. So they're very controversial topics to discuss, but I've seen this situation happen before. People will talk about this in public and you're branded as a racist straight away. So if you've got any thoughts or comments that you want to put in, and I will come back if you've got any questions for me. Keep the conversation open. If we brand everyone as a racist from the get-go, then it really doesn't move forward. Society, communities and cultures really pushes us one step backwards. Keeping dialogue open and taking things in a logical based methodology is far more respectful rather than this branding situation which occurs, which will inevitably lead to resentment and further retaliations.